All right, can everybody hear me? All right, so we're gathered here today, another in our series of special Sunday school gatherings, and I think have been incredibly informative these last few weeks, and I hope we can do it again next summer. But today's talk, Faith and Spying, is going to be delivered by Bob Wallace, and I'm sure everybody knows Bob, and he really doesn't need any introduction at all. But I'll give him one anyway. Is that his real name? I think so. Right. Now, as you know, or some of you may know, Bob, well, when I was growing up, of course, I grew up in this area, and it seems like half the people on my block, their parents worked for the military or the State Department or the other State Department, the agency that could not be named. And apparently Bob was an employee of that particular agency for a long time. And he's written quite a few books. I think many of you are well acquainted with those. Spycraft and spy sites in various cities around the country. And he goes on tour giving lectures about his experiences. But, you know, for those of us in the Logos class, we all know him as our leader in the Sunday school, but beyond that, Bob's a great friend to everybody. So I'm not going to waste any more time trying to introduce Bob because again, everybody knows Bob, and I think we're all looking forward to this.
Thank you. It is necessary to begin today's presentation in a way that is unacceptable for beginning presentations. And that is with an apology, but not really an apology. It is more of an explanation. There is no, and let me make this very clear, there is no collusion, collaboration, or consultations that occurred previous to my preparation of this talk with the pastor of the church. That is true. And it will be clear, I think, as to why I am saying that. Because each Sunday's worship in our reading of the scriptures, we conclude with, "This is the word of the Lord." And we respond, "Thanks be to God." Today, I'm going to describe biblical accounts about spying, such as those in Judges 4 and 5, that I've never heard read in church, and leave it to your judgment as to whether any of these, after any of these, we should say, "Thanks be to God."
I discourage that for any passage in Judges.
So let's begin with some observations about the Bible and spying. Spy stories are sprinkled throughout the Bible. I guess I should say spy stories reign throughout the Bible. The Bible contains more than 100 spy stories or direct references to spying. Of the 66 books in the Bible, 29 of them have a spy story or a reference to one. Both the Old and the New Testament begin with the story of a failed spy operation. And many are graphic, thus the restricted note on this particular presentation. Both successful and unsuccessful spy operations are recorded. There are good guys, good spies, and there are bad spies. The morality of the spying activity is neither endorsed nor condemned. And all of the fundamental elements of today's spy operations appear in the biblical narratives. These are the 5 pillars of spycraft. of ancient and modern spycraft: assessment, cover and disguise, concealments, covert communications, and surveillance. Elements of these are present in the biblical narratives, and they are part of contemporary intelligence operations. These include recruitment, double agents, stealing secrets, deception, influence operations, and assassinations. In the Bible, a spy story immediately follows the creation accounts in Genesis. In chapter 3, this is a summary, a case officer disguised as a snake uses misinformation to recruit an agent to steal protected goods. The agent recruits an accomplice, and together they pull off the operation. Then, in an unsuccessful attempt to evade authorities, the two build concealment devices, but eventually suffer the consequences of their actions. A few decades or centuries after this spy operation, the world faced an existential moment as Noah took command of a ship named the Last Hope. This ark, for 2 months, in a really, really big storm that dumped torrents of rain on the earth, with rivers being flooded, lakes overflowing, valleys filled, and mountains were swallowed up. Noah's zoo floated for 5 months until suddenly it didn't. Sure, the rain had seemed to stop, but what does that mean? Is it over? Where are we? Is there any future? Noah needed intelligence. And then it occurred to him that he had 2 assets on the ark that could extend his knowledge beyond the water surrounding the boat. He had an aerial surveillance capability. Noah released a raven, but its quick return was evidence that it had observed nothing but water. Noah, being a wise guy, understood that life is dynamic and intelligence needs updated. So several days later, he sent a dove aloft. Its return brought positive intelligence in the form of a leaf, which confirmed that man again had land on which to live. It was an intel mission accomplished. Birds have been part of spy operations ever since, and remain so until into the 21st century. In 1943, the British created the Dickon Medal to honor the work of animals in World War II. The first recipient of that medal was a homing pigeon. In the past 5 years, both Pakistan and China have been accused by India of using birds to spy on that country. But let's disregard the availability of modern technology and still see that the purpose of the spy in the Bible is not significantly different from today's spies. Then as now, spying is clandestinely acquiring protected information about an adversary for the benefit of oneself or one's community. Bible spies are men and women, highborn and peasant, foreigner and Israeli, old, young, wives, lovers, harlots, soldiers, civilians, holy men, and kings. They employ guile, deceit, disguise, alias, cunning, seduction, violence, and then they cheat to advance their mission. These are motivated by greed, lust, power, entrapment, revenge, money, ego, and to do good. Otherwise said, nothing has much changed in 3,500 years. Now, in Spies of the Bible, a military historian by the name of Rosemary Sheldon observed that the Hebrew scriptures display no discernible scruples about spying, and no moral qualms are raised about the use of espionage. The Ten Commandments that Moses brought down from the mountain forbid adultery, stealing, killing, false witness, and coveting. Spying didn't make the list. A British historian, Christopher Andrew, recently published The Secret World, A History of Intelligence in he published it in 2018. Chapter 1 begins with the sentence, the first major figure in the world to emphasize the importance of good intelligence was God. Andrew then made his case by summarizing the account of Moses sending the 12 spies into the promised land. Now, if George Washington is America's first spy master, Moses is the first spy master of Israel. He survived infancy because his mother and sister ran a successful operation to save their baby from death. 40 years later, he engineered a great escape by deceiving Pharaoh with a cover story about taking his clan on some type of 3-day worship retreat. Then 2 years later, he planned one of history's most famous failed intelligence operations. It was 1444 BC, give or take, a few decades, a few centuries. Moses sent a 12-man reconnaissance team into Canaan to assess the region's social, economic, and military status. This is a twice-told story. It appears as a narration in Numbers 13 and as an oral history by Moses in Deuteronomy 1. Now, looking into that unknown land, Moses instructed his spies with specific requirements. They were to target certain areas of the country, beginning with the hill area of the Negev. They were to assess the topography and productivity of the land. They were to estimate the numbers and observe the characteristics of the inhabitants. They were to identify the fortifications in the population centers. They were to acquire evidence of the productivity of the land that they were in, and they were to count the number of trees. So 40 days later, they were back, having covered more than 300 miles if they averaged 8 miles a day. And they brought proof of the bountiful country with the display of grapes, pomegranates, and figs. They also reported observing powerful people, large fortified cities, giants in the south, differing ethnic groups in the hill country, Mediterranean coast, and the Jordan River Valley. As far as we know, they didn't provide a number of trees. But then, these spies, these 12 spies, exceeded their intelligence brief by offering unsolicited analysis and policy recommendations. In a non-unanimous report, a majority of 10 said, we need to pause. This land of powerful warriors and fortified cities is too strong for us. Caleb and Joshua dissented, but fear gripped the nation. This divided policy recommendation, whether to cross the Jordan or not, created public confusion. A back to Egypt movement arose, petitions circulated for impeachment of Moses, and a leadership crisis ensued. Moses had just overseen a failed intelligence operation because his spies exceeded their brief. The objective of that recon was to gather information to support a policy decision that had already been made by God, not to assess whether or not God was wise. So by thwarting God's intent, the spy operation precluded Moses and the Exodus generation from entering the promised land. There are two spy stories about the movement of the Exodus people into Canaan, and this is the second. 40 years later, Joshua, now leader of the new generation, again stood on the east bank of the Jordan. "We're going in," he declared. But then, like Noah, he recognized that old intelligence needed updated, and in particular, he needed tactical intelligence on the first target, which was Jericho. In organizing this spy operation, Joshua avoided the mistakes made by Moses. First, he personally and secretly selected the spies for their abilities, not for their political balance. Secondly, he recognized fewer is often better, choosing 2 rather than 12. Third, these spies, his spies, were anonymous, and his spies still are. And finally, he directed a tactical mission, not a 2-month general reconnaissance. Now, as soon as the spies infiltrated Jericho, things began to fall apart. The king of Jericho's counterintelligence service spotted Joshua's spies and identified their safe house. All elements of a disaster were in place when the Bible's arguably most famous spy enters the narrative. Rahab ran a brothel atop Jericho's wall. Rooms for men included an optional entertainment package. Maybe not surprisingly, this is where the 2 spies chose to check in for the night. But then Jericho's Bureau of Investigation confronted Rahab with a search warrant, and she had to come up with a coy response. "Well, yes, indeed," she said. She had seen the spies. In fact, they had stopped at this very place, but then they immediately headed outside the city. She urged the JBI agents to hurry and catch up with them. This spy, Rahab, knew, though, how to lie, and she knew it was necessary, and hid those fugitives under piles of flax in the hotel's roof. She also understood that knowledge of spies and their activities made both her and them vulnerable. That knowledge was a valuable bargaining chip. She wanted safety for herself and her family when the attack came. So Rahab offered a deal. "I'll betray you unless you promise to protect me and my family when Jericho is conquered." Now in the business, this is called leverage, holding a high card, or some prefer blackmail. The spies had no choice but to agree. But how would the invading force know not to attack the house of Rahab? She was instructed to hang a scarlet rope from her window as a covert signal. When Jericho fell, the prostitute spy and her family were given safe passage and a place to live. Rahab is remembered in Hebrews and James as an example of righteousness for her spy work. Now, the Old Testament features a sisterhood of spies with at least a dozen women. Judith, Deborah, Jael are among the most prominent. Deborah and Jael are given 2 chapters in Joshua. Judith merits an entire book of the Apocrypha. These are women for whom a dedication to God and to the survival of Israel led them into lives of secret activity, risk, and violence. Their spy work is deceptive, bloody, and gruesome. Deborah, the only woman among Israel's 12 judges that is mentioned in the Bible, led Israel when it suffered under a Canaanite king, Jabin. Jabin had a domineering general, Sisera. Deborah finally had enough of both Jabin and Sisera and directed her military leader, Barak, to engage Sisera despite the latter's overwhelming superiority with 900 chariots versus Israel's none. Now, being no fool, Barak assessed the odds and said to Deborah, "I'm not doing this unless you go with me." Deborah, then, displaying the leadership and courage that made her a judge, agreed, but added, "General, when this is all over, a woman, not you, will get the glory of victory." So Deborah had a secret advantage. She had well-placed spies, Heber and his wife Jael, who lived in a neutral zone with a non-aggression pact with King Jabin. Heber, who had gained the trust of General Sisera, and because of that trust, provided information to the general, provided misleading information to the general on the location of Israel's force. This misinformation prompted Sisera to concentrate his forces in a location known to and favorable to Israel. So with such intelligence from her spy, Israel's lesser force, led by Deborah and Barak, and aided by a heavy rain, which immobilized the horse-drawn chariots, routed the enemy. General Sisera became separated from his army, but sought refuge in the neutral territory with Heber's clan. He found Heber's tent and was met there by the non-threatening Jael. She invited the general to rest, promised him safety and protection, and always a gracious host offered him warm milk to drink. This was a drink that would induce drowsiness. But before going to sleep, a cautious Sisera asked Jael to tell anyone who came looking for him he wasn't in the tent. Then, with Sisera snoring, driving her crazy, Jael seized the opportunity to demonstrate her true allegiance. The Message translation is this: she took a tent peg and hammer, tiptoed toward him, and drove the tent peg through his temple and all the way into the ground. He convulsed and died. So without their general, Jabin's army was routed, and the two women, not Barak, received credit for the victory. Now, of such accounts, Sheldon has observed, usual morality is dispensed with in these kinds of intelligence operations. Now, for your optional reading, and I have some papers to pass out when we're finished. This gives you optional reading for Bible spy stories. Judith's operation is described in the Apocrypha book by her name. It's a story that parallels the Deborah and Jael adventure, and it combines, it's longer, and has a greater combination of suspense, deception, sexual content, violence, body manipulation, and gore. So I'll leave it to you to decide whether or not Judith should be the 40th book of our Old Testament. The Bible Hall of Fame includes an accomplished harpist. He went by the stage name of David. He was as much a long shot to be king of Israel as Harry Truman was to be president of the United States. David survived as king because he was a master of spying. Truman created the CIA. I know of no other parallels at this point. In 1 Samuel 16, in a secret treasonous ceremony, the prophet Samuel anointed David secretly the king of Israel. David subsequently then made national headlines with his well-placed headshot at Goliath and joined Saul's court. Saul's son Jonathan became David's close friend and spy. Jonathan reported to David about Saul's plans, whereabouts, and his health. Images of David and Jonathan reflect the two in a field with Jonathan shooting arrows. Sport was not the reason for this outing. It was a time when David's life was threatened if he was in Saul's presence, and this covert communication plan was devised based on the technology of the time, bow and arrow. Jonathan would communicate with David by launching arrows toward a location where David was hidden. If the arrow fell short of the location, David was safe. If the arrow went beyond the location, that meant he should run his life. In a particular instance, Jonathan shot long, and David ran and was able to survive. Now, every day, such non-alerting items, such as thumbtacks, chalk marks, plants on doorsteps, these kinds of things, are all still used by spies for nonverbal covert communication. But threats on David's life continued throughout his reign. In a coup attempt by his son Absalom, spies loyal to David would reverse this regime change effort. As David aged, Absalom, young, handsome, energetic, and ambitious, coveted the throne. He attracted a following and sent influencers throughout Israel to whip up fervor for his conspiracy. The insurrection forced David to abandon Jerusalem, but he left behind a stay-behind network of 3 secret loyalists: the high priest Zadok, the court advisor Hushai, and a courier also named Jonathan. Hushai was Absalom's national security advisor, so he would inform Zadok of Absalom's military plans. The high priest would then convey those to Jonathan, who carried the information to David. When Absalom decided to attack David militarily with the coup, the network, the Hushai Zadok Jonathan network, delivered advance warning. With this timely intelligence, David avoided a trap, regrouped his army, and engaged in a battle during which Absalom was killed. The ill-fated coup ended with the message to David, quote, "Jehovah has rescued you from all those who rebelled against you," unquote. Nevertheless, David mourned the death of his son Absalom. This is one dramatic example throughout David's 40 years of rule when he used intelligence for political and military ends. In fact, several psalms associated to or associated with David include language that refers to or alludes to elements of spying and clandestine operations. You will see those on the screen, and no doubt several of those are included in the book that is displayed, but I need to check that more thoroughly. But to conclude this partial look at David's use of intelligence, I would say I don't believe we dishonor God by observing that well-placed spies, reliable covert communications, and timely intelligence partially account for David's success and survival as king. Okay, now for a little change of pace and maybe audience participation. So during the previous minutes, I'm sure that some of you have been asking, well, is there a Bible James Bond? So what we're going to do now is a variation of the Bible sword drill, if you're familiar with the sword drill. The sword drill is when the leader gives a Bible passage, and the audience all having Bibles, real Bibles, not Bibles that are on a cell phone, and they go through the Bible and find the verse, like verses like Hezekiah 4:6. How quickly can you find that? How quickly can you find it? So this is a variation, okay, the introduction. I'm going to identify characteristics of James Bond. When you see that characteristic, if there's a Bible personality that shares that characteristic that comes to mind and seems to fit the definition of a spy, don't shout it out, just raise your hand, okay? Then I'm going to read another characteristic, and that person that's in your head, if that second characteristic still meets the person's in your head, keep your hand up. If it doesn't, or then take your hand down again. No embarrassment here. I mean, Mary Margaret had no idea. Very disappointing, that somebody who comes to Sunday school every week, with Bob Whitten's class, Anyway, here we go. I'm going to show you these characteristics. Okay. Got an idea? Handsome, young, healthy, agile, strong. Put your hand up, Gene. Act like you're playing anyway. Okay. This person acts in service of his country. Okay. This person is single, but was once married.
What if the Bible's unclear on their state?
Who's giving the presentation? Who set up this program anyway? Who operates, this person operates, James Bond operates as a lone wolf, and this person does the same. This person is attracted to and by beautiful women. Person survives harrowing escapes, a virtual Houdini. The person wields multiple weapons effectively. Breaks and destroys stuff, but doesn't have to file any reports. Kills with no apparent regard. Regard too. Both of those. Named in the New Testament. Now, this is, okay, now here's the clincher. I think probably several people might raise their hand on this. Okay, how we doing? You ready for the answer?
Yes.
Ready for the answer? Is Samson.
Yes.
Bible Bond is Samson. All of those characteristics, I think, are generally correct of both of them. And as you recall, those of you who have seen the last Bond movie, James Bond calls in a missile strike on himself, and that's the last scene in the movie. What? Speak up, if you dare. So that I thought, well, there were some interesting parallels between Samson and James Bond, and I believe that reading this is Judges 16 on the handout that I will give. I describe the Samson story as a honey trap, because in fact that's exactly what Delilah became for the Philistines to trap Samson. Okay. That's what we're going to do on the Old Testament. There are a few more, like 40 or 45 more. After chapter 1's genealogy in the New Testament, Matthew's account of Jesus' birth opens with King Herod conducting opposition research and elicitation. He follows that with a recruitment pitch to some foreigners to spy on a potential rival. The seemingly compliant recruits, however, subsequently acted on a divine covert message and betrayed the king. It's not a stretch to say that Jesus' life, just like David's and like Moses, was saved on the action of spies. I'm going to make another comment on that just momentarily. There are several passages, several references that point to Jesus being spied on by his opponents. Luke 4 and John 8 indicate at times Jesus resorted to escape and evasion maneuvers to avoid capture. Rosemary Sheldon contends that the Synoptic Gospels' description of arrangements for the Passover meal imply Jesus had a secret network of supporters beyond the identified disciples. Such is limited evidence, and I tend to dismiss this as conjecture. I doubt that Jesus had a spy network because I conclude that spying in our common understanding and Jesus' life do not mix well. Jesus' mission involved neither acquiring nor retaining personal or national power, which is often the basis for our spying. Nevertheless, Jesus' betrayal by Judas does represent a classic spying operation. Judas was an insider, motivated by money to betray and possibly disappointment with Jesus' leadership. He was recruited by the other side. His actionable intelligence led directly to Jesus' apprehension, and in a complete end-to-end intelligence operation, the recruitment concluded with the callous termination of the agent, that is Judas, by his handlers, and the spy's suicidal remorse. In Acts, we can also infer that Saul, who breathed out murderous threats against the early church, employed spies. Later, Paul's life was saved by a clandestine exfiltration when he was concealed in a basket that was lowered through a hole in the city wall. Such contemporary exfiltration operations are not uncommon. So with those brief mentions from the New Testament, this concludes my selected sampling of the Bible spy stories. With respect to a conclusion on the topic of spying and faith, I'm going to quote Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. Quote, "Here are suggestions of my own. They are not direct commandments from the Lord, but they seem right to me." Unquote. I have been challenged as to whether CIA employment is compatible with Christian faith. A respected Baptist minister was quite direct. Quote, "The CIA teaches you to lie and live a life of deceit. There's no way that can be Christian." Unquote. A college classmate sent me an email 4 or 5 years ago. Quote, "I don't envy or covet you, what you are or what you have done. In fact, I would not want to stand before God and confess it." Unquote. So these comments, taken together with the biblical spy episodes, may invite, I think, mature reflection on some key themes. And these are the key themes. One, God is active in all elements of national and personal life. Secondly, history is much more than random and chance events. Third, spies have played a part in critical international affairs and events of biblical history. Thus, Rahab, who performed the work of a spy, as well as Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Samuel, Samson, Gideon, Joseph, all of whom had their hands in the spy business, are commended as heroes of the faith in Hebrews 11. And finally, Bible spy stories point to God's presence in the daily events of life, a presence that often becomes revealed and understood only at great distance. So to repeat, there was no collusion with Rob on this presentation, but we both use Habakkuk today. And Habakkuk wrote this, 2:3. Revelation awaits, so wait for it. It will certainly come and not delayed. So thank you very much, and I'll pass out the additional reading, and thank you very much for attending. Thank you. There's one for every family, I think, in terms of how, if you want them.
Thank you. Bob, have you included Ehud in your studies on that?
There is nobody who is excluded. It is an inclusive look at spies.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, and I'll be happy if there's any questions. Happy to take any questions. Let me. I'm going to run through. Actually, this is pretty interesting, I think. William Webster died last week or a few days ago. He was the only person ever to serve as director of the CIA and the FBI. So he had knowledge of the offensive and defensive intelligence operations, and he was asked about the ethics of intelligence, and these are the three elements. Now he's not talking about a church in the church sense or in the faith sense. He's just talking about national policy and the morality and the ethics of spying intelligence operations in the international world. And these are the three elements that he considered to be critical to making decisions about what kind of intelligence operations would be run by the United States government. Conforming to law, reflecting values, and then making sense to the broader public. I thought those did very nicely in summarizing it. So, okay, thank you very much.